Good morning. I'm just analysing the same game for the second time. There was a problem with my recording the first time. I updated the OBS today and yeah, I didn't like that, so I think it should be okay now. The other day I saw a video by Joszef Chess Channel, a great channel, really educational, really hard-working man. There's a full-time job and does videos in his spare time. It's really fantastic. You should really support him if you can. You can learn a great deal from his videos. I have. But one of the things he likes to make videos on is the latest in computer chess. And he featured a game where Stockfish had played black and had played the Jænisch gambit. It can be called the Schliemann defense as well. I always call it the Jænisch gambit because I love to play a gambit. And Stockfish had won this game, and in the video, Joszef mentioned that there had been a game in this variation between Caruana and Aronian, and I thought, okay, I'll check that out. I'll make a video on that. But the game was 83 moves long, and it ended with a very technical rook and pawn end game, and you know that doesn't really suit my style of video making well, and I'm not really a good enough endgame player to talk about technical endgames. There are lots of good books you can buy on technical rook and pawn endgames. If you've got a table with uneven sized legs, no, I'm joking. They are very much worth studying, but I don't think you can learn anything from me about technical rook and pawn endgames. So, whilst I was looking at that game on Chess Games, I found this game, which is between Dawid Bronstein and Joszef Szily. It's played in, you'll have to excuse my Hungarian pronunciation. I'll do my best. It was played in 1946. Moscow, Budapest, it says. Played in Moscow, so I don't know if this was a match between Moscow and Budapest, correspondence or whatever. There aren't any more details than that. But it's a fine game in the Jænisch gambit, where Bronstein shows that he's got another side to his play than just attacking play, and that the Jænisch gambit has more to it than just the chance of surprising your opponent with an attack. But it's Bronstein. There will be an attack in the end. Relax. Okay, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Royal Lopez. I think still the most played opening in chess, still the most popular opening in chess, and played at all levels, has been played at all levels for many hundreds of years. So, yeah, I never play it, but that's beside the point. Okay, so we're at the starting position for the Jænisch gambit, and Bronstein plays the outlandish f5. Szily takes the pawn. Maybe not the wisest choice. I think nowadays you would see most often d3. That's certainly the move that Caruana played against Aronian. So, yeah, a modern player might be more cautious than just taking the pawn. But Bronstein plays this Vienna-like idea where you push the pawn, and yeah, the knight can't really come forward. It will get taken. So you have two choices. You can retreat the knight, or you can play the queen. Sometimes, I'm not going to show any of these moves because I want to encourage you to learn these things yourself. Sometimes white will take the knight on c6, thinking then I can play my knight to e5. And as is often the case in Royal Lopez type openings, you take with the d pawn to open up the file for your queen. And then if he does play knight to d5, then you play the queen to threaten the knight. Wait a minute, what happens with queen? h5 check, a common theme. Then black has the opportunity to play the pawn, take with the pawn, and take with the pawn, threaten the queen, and now threaten the queen with the rook. The queen on d4 in this instance defends the rook on h8, which is not usually the case, and so people fall for this. But Szily is far too good a player to fall for that. And he plays queen to e2 so that Bronstein can no longer take the knight on f3 because the pawn is pinned. And exactly as in the Vienna game, black plays queen to e7 to threaten again to take the knight. So he takes the knight on c6 so they can come to e5, d4 with these knights. And you know, I wasn't sure about this, but I've checked. It's what I play. Of course, it's the right move from Bronstein. You can ignore everything I said before about taking with the d pawn and opening this file. In this instance, you take with the c pawn so that you can then later play pawn to d5 to create a very useful and strong pawn chain in the middle. So you take with the c pawn, not the b pawn, sorry, not the d pawn in this instance, and that's what Bronstein does. And the knight has to move, and now it can move to e4, d4. It's no longer threatened by the knight. You might think, oh great, now I can play that d5 move and attack this pawn. No, you can't, because this pawn is attacked by the knight. So if you play pawn to d5, you remove the only defender of the c6 pawn, and white will gladly take that and, you know, threaten your queen and have a lovely position. So that isn't possible. So black develops a piece to develop a piece and to make it so that he is now defending the pawn on e4 twice, with the knight and with the queen. Szily responds in kind by developing a piece and attacking the pawn on d4, e4 even. Yeah, c5, whilst the pawn still defends the c6 square. Excellent. So, yeah, he retreats the knight, and now he can play d5. Look at that lovely strong centre, and he's threatening to take the pawn on f5 to begin trying to defend with pawn to g5 is maybe not the wisest choice in the world. You know, you might get yourself in a great deal of trouble there by not developing. So comes with the queen, and he's now threatening to take the pawn on c5. There's only one sensible way to defend. Well, there's two. You could play bishop to d7, but Bronstein chooses queen to d7, saying to his opponent, yeah, go ahead, swap off the queens. I'll end up with this fantastic centre, good development, and this pawn is almost impossible to defend in that situation. I'll eventually play pawn to c6 and have a fantastic pawn chain in the middle and be in a winning endgame type position. And Szily agrees with Bronstein and moves his queen out of the way. Now he's got two threats against the pawn on c5. It's threatened by the knight and it's threatened by the queen. So Bronstein moves his queen to a better square where it defends also the pawn on c5 and has more possibilities, and now opens up the possibility of the bishop taking the pawn on f5. This is your plan when you play f5, the Jænisch gambit. Your plan is that eventually you're going to get the opportunity to develop your bishop by taking the pawn on f5, and he works consistently towards that goal. So now he's got 3 attackers on the c pawn. Is it possible to defend? Yeah, you could come with your knight to d7 to defend that pawn, but then you're making it so that your bishop doesn't any longer see the pawn on f5, and it's a bit difficult to develop your bishop at all. So Bronstein, typical Bronstein, comes up with a better move, which is a tactical defense. He plays rook to b8. How does that defend the pawn? Well, no, if you take the pawn with the knight, then rook comes to b5, and you're forking the knight and the queen, and you're going to win one of them. What about the pawn on a7? Szily daren't take the pawn on a7 because the rook then comes back to a8, and the queen doesn't have any squares. So he daren't do that. So he's got to move a pawn to develop his bishop. He's made it impossible for the b pawn to move, so he has to move the d pawn to get his bishop into play. So he plays d5 with a threat on c5. But I think it might have been better to play d3 and accept that you're going to be losing a pawn at some point in time, near the f pawn or whatever. A d pawn gives black the opportunity to play c4 and attack the knight and make the development for black difficult, for white difficult. So he plays knight to c5, and now the idea of letting the pawn go on a7 and then attacking with the queen isn't going to work, because after the rook goes back to h8, a8, the queen can come to, well, it can't come to b7, the rook's defending. Yeah, okay, yeah, okay, forget that, I'm talking rubbish. What's unusual there? So develops his last piece, his next to last piece, and gets ready to castle. You can't argue with that. And now he's threatening to take the pawn and break up that lovely centre for black. So Bronstein thinks, yeah, well, that's okay. I'm just gonna castle. I'm gonna have a better position anyway. I'm still gonna take on f5, and then the pawn on e4 will be defended. And if you take there, well, I can just take back, and then your pawns are generally looking a bit silly, and I still have all the advantages which I've already mentioned. So this has a threat with it, h3. It threatens to play pawn to g5 and establish a pawn chain which can't be broken. It's like saying to Bronstein, it's now or never. You want that pawn back with development, it's now or never. And so it's now, which is great. And now, as you see, black has completed development. His king is castled. His rooks see one another. Finish with that job. White has to move the bishop, castle the king to one side or the other to be in the same state. So he's somehow managed to fall a move or two behind. He's lost a couple of tempi in the opening. It's one of the other less seen advantages of the Jænisch gambit is that you gain a couple of tempi. So yeah. He comes out with the bishop to support the knight. Now the idea of rook to f5 to win is to win a pawn is not as strong, because the bishop also defends the square c5, and he's ready to castle to either side. So He's taking back some of the tempi he has lost. Well, he had that anyway, so yeah. Brings the knight back to swap off. He's perfectly willing to swap off on c5. He's perfectly willing to swap off on d7. He's confident in the strength of his position. I'm confident in the strength of his position as well. Of course, if Szily takes the knight, you have to take back with a bishop, because otherwise the pawn on d5 is undefended. And not only that, but white could take it with check. But he doesn't do that. He thinks, yeah, it's getting a bit dodgy for the old queen here. I think he'll yeah, escape. So Szily plays knight to b6. So if you take the pawn here, then the knight takes the pawn. It's a lovely position. You get a fork on the knight and bishop, and you can probably end up with two bishops against two knights to add to all the advantages you had from before in this game. Also, playing knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, is good as well. It makes the pawn structure weak, because you can't in this instance afford to play knight takes knight, because then the bishop comes here. Oh no, pawn here. Yeah, forget that. But yeah, he doesn't want that anyway. So he moves the knight out of the way. He doesn't want to repair Bronstein's pawns by taking on e6, b6 even. So the queen comes on move 19 to e8, so that it has vision over both the queen side and the king side. I will have something to say about this move at the end of the game. Yeah. So he's threatening maybe to come to a5 and chase the knights away. Bronstein takes on c3, so that when the knight moves, the pawn on b3 will be undefended. So he takes back, and look at that. A fantastic pawn chain. Really, makes a big difference that Bronstein has this pawn chain. Yeah, the knight wasn't doing anything on c3, didn't have any forward moves. He's thinking possibly coming to g3 and threatening the bishop. Yeah, again, he's willing to do the swap off, and you see that he now has a direct attack on the pawn on b3. So Bronstein takes the pawn on b3, and now he can't afford to play knight takes knight, because then it's now that bishop to b4 works. So if he takes with the knight, bishop to b4 wins the queen, so he can't afford to take the knight. And he can't therefore afford to take the bishop on e6. So he comes to e6 to open up the line for the rook against the king. And Szily decides it's getting a bit uncomfortable. He'd better get out of there. Maybe not the wisest decision in the world, because as we can expect from the Bronsteins of this world, he just takes that as an invitation to play an attack. Now obviously, if you play pawn takes pawn, that's going to lead to problems for white. I invite you to calculate yourself what kind of attack black would produce if white plays pawn takes pawn. Answers to me on a postcard, please. No. What would happen is if he takes the pawn here, then the queen would come to g6, check, and then after the queen comes to g6, the king has to go to g1, it's the only square he's got, and then the rook comes to f3, threatening mate here. The knight has to come here, the rook takes, and then the rook, the bishop takes, and then when the pawn takes, the rook takes the pawn, and then you're threatening to play queen to h5 or h6 mate. Very, impossible to stop. And you've also got the threat of rook to h2 as well. So he doesn't take. He plays queen to g3. Oh, sorry. I pressed the wrong button. He plays knight to g3 instead, so that he is now threatening to take the pawn. And then comes to g3, queen to g6 anyway, saying, well, if you take the pawn, I'm going to take your knight with my bishop, and I'm going to have an attack anyway. But white feels like he's got no choice. He has to take the knight, the bishop now. And he does that. And of course Bronstein takes the knight with the bishop to break open the king. Yeah, you might think knight takes knight, a fork on the rooks, got to be good for black. No, because white then plays bishop takes pawn, discovered check, the king has to go here, and again the rook can come here and threaten rook here, check. So no, that's not going to work. So he moves the king. And so that he's now threatening to take the rook, the bishop on g3. And Bronstein says, yeah, go ahead, take that bishop, fine for me. I'm just going to take the pawn on h3 anyway. He could defend the pawn by moving the bishop, defend the pawn by an x-ray with the queen, but if he does that, the rook is just going to come to f3 anyway and attack the queen, and then it's even more quickly over. So he takes the bishop, realizes he's got to accept that. Bronstein says check, one more check, king goes to the corner. A lovely little move by Bronstein. Now he plays the rook so that he's threatening an eventual mate. So he has to take. Bronstein then takes. And now he's a piece down. But he has 6 pawns against 3. So he has 3 pawns for the piece. Theoretical material equality. I can assure you Bronstein is interested in mate, not in theoretical material equality. So the king moves, and then a lovely little in-betweener by Bronstein. He takes the knight so that that threat no longer exists, so, and also so that that knight can't interfere with these plans that come now. Yeah, could he play rook to f1 and chase away the queen? Yeah, he could, but then he's just 3 pawns down in that case, and still his king is very exposed. So he takes the knight, of course. This gives Bronstein another check, and he goes to g1, h1 even. Yeah, what do you do in these situations when you're attacking? You bring all your pieces into play. Lovely. No, he's threatened to play slow motion, but it works. Rook to h4, 5 even, and rook here mate. So the queen tries to interfere with that plan. But he's got another plan, which is to check first with the queen, and then play rook to f6. And now he's threatening rook to g6, and then rook to g2, rook or queen to g2 mate. So he tries to make an escape for his king, but there is no escape for the king. Check, and now He's thinking that when he checks here, he can escape to e2, but he can't. Because of course when he comes to e2, the d3 square is protected by the pawn. Queen d3. It's checkmate. So I said I would have something to say about this queen move. Queen to e8. Yeah, you can see I've highlighted the pawn chain that Bronstein has built up in this position. And this pawn chain does several things which can be important for attacking chess. One of the things is it locks the center. If the center is wide open and you go to an attack on one side of the board, then you're not really stopping your opponent from making a counter attack on the other side. And counter attacks are often more dangerous than attacks, and really you want to put a stop to that. So it does that. It gives Bronstein a positional advantage, which means that in any endgame he will be winning. But it does a third, an equally important thing. Bronstein played queen to e8, a very easy transfer from the queen side to the king side. And it was very easy for Bronstein, after the first rooks were swapped off, to play his other rook to the king side. The pawn chain facilitates the easy and direct movements of pieces from one side of the board to the other. This is one of the reasons why, when Bronstein had established that as a positional advantage, he was able then to create an attack, because he had more space, because he's got a pawn on the fifth rank, on his fifth rank, where his opponent only, well, he has a pawn on his fifth rank now, but you know, this extra space here, we're not counting that. So he has more space, but he has easier movement from one side of the board to the other. In this case, from c6 to d8 with the queen, and from a8 to f8 to f6 to g6 with the rook. And that proved to be a decisive factor in this game. So, what do we learn from this game? We learn that the Jænisch gambit isn't just a novelty attempt to surprise your opponent, to get him to walk into a trap. That actually there are positional advantages, such as the greater space afforded by the pawn that you quickly get to e4, and such as the pawn chain, which can be established here, which makes transfer of pieces from one side of the board to the other easier and locks the center, so that easier transport of pieces from one side of the board to the other can facilitate your attacking play. So kind of some deep ideas illustrated by Bronstein in this Jænisch gambit attack. And of course, an attack and a beautiful finish, exactly as we expect from the Bronsteins of this world. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe on this video. All of these things help me. Okay, thanks. Bye.